Hey everyone, welcome back to another video of mine where today we're going to be solving Leetcode problem 14 titled Longest Common Prefix. Okay, so we have to basically write a function to find the longest common prefix string amongst an array of strings, right? And of course, if there's no common prefix, we can simply return an empty string as denoted by these adjacent quotation marks, right? So I think that this is a very important problem to actually go over in my channel because a lot of my friends who actually applied in Apple got asked this very problem. And I think it is a pretty common programming or technical coding interview question. So I think it's a great problem to go over, like I said, on this YouTube channel, right? So an example, I think that the problem statement is very, very straightforward, and so I don't think it should be too hard, but just to visualize this a bit better, we'll go through the examples, right? So in example 1, we have a strings of an array of strings. We have a strings input of an array of strings, sorry, and the strings within our array is going to be flower, flow, and flight. And our output would be the string of FL, or basically two characters, right? Because these two characters, FL, appear in every single element or every single string embedded within our array input, right? And as you can see, FL, those two characters, are within every single string within our input array strings, right? So in example 2, if we apply that same logic, we'd output basically an empty string because there's no common prefix or no common elements that appear or that are contained within every single string or every single possible word in our input array strs, right? So I think that this is a pretty simple problem, right? It has a very straightforward solution and a very straightforward problem statement, and so I think it's best if we just dive into the code and I'll explain what actually each line of code does as we code the solution up. So we'll have a resolution string, right? And this resolution string is of course going to be initialized to an empty string. And this is ultimately going to be the string that I return after I append every single valid element that appears that are within the range of every single length of every single string, and that is contained within every single string. I'll simply return res, right? This is basically going to be my final answer, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop through the indices of just the first string in our input array. So I'll say for I in the range of the length of strings at 0. So basically the very first element in our array, right? So in this example here, I would just basically be looping through the indices of flower and only flower, nothing else, because that's the very first element that appears in my array, right? So for I in the range of the length of strings at 0, that 0th indice, I'll loop again through every single string or every single word that's actually inside of my input array. So I'll say for s in strings. Note that I'm not actually looping through the indices of these strings of the entire input, but rather just the strings or words themselves, right? So for s in strings, now we'll actually have some invalidating conditionals, right? So these conditionals are basically going to check if I don't meet some specific criteria and I don't actually have any common elements that are contained within every single element or every single string within my input array, and that are within the index or length of every single, or within the range of the length of all of the input strings in our array. So we'll say if I, basically the current index that we're looking at, that we start or initialize to strings at 0, if I is actually equal to the length of s, so it's basically out of bounds for any string or any word within my input array, or s at I doesn't actually equal strings at 0 at I, right? So they don't share any common elements, or it's just out of bounds, or basically greater than the length of any string within my input array, I can simply just stop that checking of that element in this function, and I can simply return my res, whatever elements it has so far, if any, right? And of course, if this is not true, I can exit my for loop, of course, still within this for loop on line 4, because I still have to add the valid elements within the length of strings at 0. I can simply add to my resolution string strings at 0 at I, right? So to kind of just recap this code, basically whatever we did was we initialized a resolution string on line 3, which basically is going to be the string of the final answer that has all of the common elements or characters that are contained within every single string in our input array. right? And then we loop through the length, or basically the indices of strings at the strings at 0, or basically the very first string in our input array. And then right underneath that, or indented below that, we'll loop through every single string as a whole within our input array. Not the indices of them, but every single string as a whole, right? So for S in the strings input array of strings, right? And now we actually have invalidating conditionals to check if any ith indices or elements of that ith indice of the string at 0 is actually not matching or greater or out of bounds for any other strings. Then we simply need to return res and stop the execution, right? So if I is equal to length of S, or is basically I is out of bounds for any S or for any string in our input array, or S at any ith indice or any value is not equal to and that same corresponding value as strings at 0, then we don't actually have any matching elements out of the same indice between every single string within an input array. We can simply return res of whatever elements it has so far, and we can stop the execution of that iteration. Otherwise, if that's not true, we'll simply add to our resolution strings at 0 or I, where I is basically the indice of every single validating indice that is within the range of the length of every single input string, and also is contained within every single string in our input array, as basically denoted, basically passes the criteria that we posted and coded up on line 6, right? And at this point, we can simply return res, and we are done. So unless I made any syntax errors here, it should be okay. And as you can see, it is just about as efficient you can get, beating 61% of users runtime complexity-wise and memory complexity-wise. Although it says I only beat 30% of users, I can submit this again, and it'll probably skyrocket. Right? As you can see now, it says I beat 95% of users. So you really can't trust these beats /% of users on Leetcode, at least, as it's ultimately random, as I said before in my previous videos. Right? So if I haven't said this in my video yet, I don't recall if I did. This is actually a very, very common coding interview question, especially at Apple, right? And so I think it's a very good problem to know and to know the solution for, and just to know how to solve in general. So if you guys enjoyed this video and learned something new, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It really does mean a lot. And without further ado, I will see you guys in my next video.